Imagine like a global race, a really grueling, high-stakes endurance run featuring nearly 200 of the most advanced, highly engineered vehicles on the planet.
Oh, I like this analogy.
Right. So you're watching the leaderboards, tracking the top speeds, the luxury interiors, the raw horsepower. And down in 26th place, there is this very respectable, fast, comfortable car.
But it's not exactly breaking any land speed records.
Exactly. It's not breaking records, but it's cruising comfortably in the top tier. But then right in the middle of the race, the judges make this massive, unprecedented announcement. They are changing the rules.
Which throws everything into chaos.
Complete chaos. Because they aren't just measuring top speed anymore. Suddenly they are measuring how far each car can travel on a single gallon of gas without, poisoning the air around the track.
Environmental cost.
Yeah. And the moment those new rules are applied, a wave of chaos just hits the leaderboard. The cars in first, second, and third place, these massive gas-guzzling behemoths, they suddenly stall out.
Because they get heavily penalized.
Right. They are penalized so heavily for their toxic exhaust that they just plummet down the rankings. But that car in 26th place, it barely flinches.
Which is the crazy part.
It is. Because of the way its engine is fundamentally built, it sails right past the faltering leaders and miraculously catapults up 22 spots to take fourth place in the entire world.
It's the ultimate statistical plot twist.
Uh-huh.
And, it completely upends how we traditionally think about winning the race of global progress.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you are listening to us right now, you are the learner. You are the third person in this room with us.
Glad to have you here.
And you're here because you want to grasp these massive, complex currents shaping our global future. But you don't want to get buried under a mountain of impenetrable academic jargon.
Or stared spreadsheets that go on for, 10,000 rows.
Nobody wants that. You want the insight. You want the aha moment. You want to understand the actual mechanisms behind the numbers. And today we have a mission that requires exactly that kind of curiosity.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape of human development that is traditionally very murky. We have this massive stack of data files on the table between us today, tracing the trajectory of global human progress all the way from 1990 to 2023.
That's a huge timeline.
It is. But our specific focus, our magnifying glass today, is hovering over one specific nation, and that's France.
And we are not just doing a generic tour of European statistics here. We are here to solve the mystery of that 26th place car. Because the scenario I just described, that is not a hypothetical.
No, it's not.
That is the exact, literal, mathematical reality sitting on page 1 of our research report today.
And what's fascinating here is how this challenges the established dogma. For decades, the unspoken rule of human development has been this deeply ingrained assumption that highly developed nations, the ones with the best hospitals, the highest education, the most comfortable living standards, they achieve those peaks by burning through massive amounts of resources.
Right, like the more you have, the more of the earth you had to dig up, pave over, or burn to get it.
Exactly. It was a direct, linear transaction. We have historically associated extreme societal comfort with extreme environmental consumption. It was considered the unavoidable cost of doing business as a modern developed nation.
But the data sitting in front of us totally shatters that rule, because in 2023, under the Standard Human Development Index, France ranks 26th globally.
A very solid, wealthy, developed nation.
But when you apply the planetary pressures adjustment, which is this mathematical penalty for high resource consumption and heavy carbon footprints, France jumps to 4th in the world.
Up 22 spots.
They have somehow engineered a society that maintains world-class human development while dramatically mitigating the planetary penalty that just completely sinks their peers.
So the big question is, how on earth did they do it?
That is the mission for this deep dive. Over the next hour, we are going to reverse engineer this French blueprint. We are going to crack open 5 core dimensions of this data.
We're looking at health, knowledge, wealth, equality, and their environmental footprint.
Right. To understand exactly how the society operates, we are going to look at the actual mechanisms they've built over the last 30 years. Because if it is mathematically and practically possible to decouple extreme human well-being from extreme planetary destruction, it changes the entire conversation about what your future and the future of global progress actually looks like.
But to understand the leap to fourth place, we first have to understand the baseline. We have to look at the foundation of this entire statistical architecture before we start adding the complex planetary penalties.
Okay, let's unpack this baseline. The gold standard for measuring how well a country is doing is the Human Development Index.
And we will try to keep the acronyms to a minimum today, but you will hear HDI a lot.
Yeah, HDI is a big one. It is a composite score. It's not just checking the size of a country's bank account. It blends health, education, and income into one single number between 0 and 1, with 1 being absolute utopian perfection.
So a score of 1.0 would mean everyone lives incredibly long, perfectly healthy lives, has access to infinite education, and possesses just boundless wealth.
Which obviously no country is at a 1.0.
Right, no one is there. But looking at the 2023 data, the overall HDI score for France is 0.920.
And for context, the global average sits at 0.756.
A score of 0.920 is exceptionally high. It places France firmly in the very high human development category. But, the static number for 2023 isn't nearly as interesting as the historical trajectory.
Oh, the timeline is wild.
It is. If we look at the timeline spanning back to 1990, we see a story of relentless compounding growth.
In 1990, France was sitting at a score of 0.798. Over 30 years, it just steadily climbed the mountain to reach that 0.920. Meanwhile, the world average started at a much lower 0.663 in 1990 and grew to 0.756 today.
And if you look at the trend lines side by side, France has consistently maintained a lead of roughly 21.7% over the global average for over 3 decades.
Which is incredible consistency.
That consistency is crucial to understand. It is a parallel trajectory, but it is elevated by over 20 percentage points for a third of a century. It implies a structural advantage that doesn't just fluctuate with the daily whims of the global stock market.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
A 21.7% lead sounds fantastic on a chart, but is this just the compounding effect of historical wealth? I mean, France has been an industrialized, wealthy, imperial power for centuries. Is this 0.920 score just the inertia of old money keeping them artificially ahead of the global average?
Or are there specific active daily mechanisms keeping them in that top tier?
Exactly.
That is the pivotal question. Is it inertia or is it active engineering? And the data gives us a very clear answer when we look at how the system responds to extreme stress.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Look at the graph around the year 2020.
The global pandemic, the great diagnostic shock to the entire world system.
Precisely. If France's high development score was purely the result of historical inertia, just old money sitting in a vault, a massive acute crisis like a global pandemic would cause a catastrophic, lasting fracture.
And we do see a very visible dip in the data.
We do. The data shows France dropped from a high of 0.914 in 2019 down to 0.909 in 2020.
Which makes total sense. I mean, supply chains froze, hospitals were overwhelmed, schools shut down, the entire composite index took a hit.
But look at the subsequent 3 years. The rebound is remarkably strong. By 2023, not only have they recovered, but they have pushed past their pre-pandemic peak to hit a new historical high of 0.920.
Wow.
This tells us that the 21.7% gap isn't just a stagnant pile of money. It represents deeply embedded active societal mechanisms.
So things like physical infrastructure, localized medical networks, institutional knowledge, and robust safety nets.
Yes, exactly. It's about resilience, not just riches. The system bends under the weight of a once-in-a-century crisis, but it doesn't snap. It absorbs the kinetic energy of the shock and springs back.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, money alone doesn't bounce a society back from a lethal airborne virus.
No, it doesn't. You need mechanisms that physically protect the human beings who make up that society, which forces us to crack open the HDI formula and look at its very first and undeniably most vital ingredient.
Human survival. Because none of the other numbers matter, not the wealth, not the education, not the environmental footprint, if the citizens aren't actually living long enough to experience the society they are building.
Right. So let's look at the health dimension of the HDI. The primary metric used here is life expectancy at birth. In 2023, France is sitting at an incredible 83.3 years.
83.3 years. Compare that to the global average, which currently sits at 73.4 years.
That is a full decade.
10 extra years of life. Think about the gravity of that for a second. An entire extra decade to spend with your grandchildren, to read, to travel, to pursue a second career, to simply exist.
It's massive.
And this isn't just a lucky genetic trait. This is the result of how the society is structured.
It is the ultimate downstream metric of a society's success. Because to get a national average up to 83.3 years, you cannot just rely on a few billionaires living to 100 to pull the average up.
Right. The math doesn't work that way.
Exactly. You have to systematically eliminate the causes of premature death across the entire population. You need universal preventative care, you need rapid emergency response times, you need strict occupational safety regulations so people aren't dying in factory accidents, and you need robust geriatric care.
I want to dig into the demographic breakdown of this survival data because the gender dynamics here are fascinating. The report gives us the exact split.
Let's hear it.
French women in 2023 are living to an astonishing 86.1 years. That is up from 81.0 years back in 1990. So over 3 decades, the society figured out how to give women an extra 5 years of life.
A 5-year leap in a single generation is a monumental public health achievement. It speaks to massive advancements in specialized healthcare, particularly, postmenopausal care and cardiovascular treatments tailored specifically to women.
But then look at the men. French men have seen an even more dramatic shift. In 2023, male life expectancy is 80.4 years. But back in 1990, it was only 72.7 years.
Wow.
Yeah. That is an increase of nearly 8 full years for men.
This is where the mechanisms of society really reveal themselves, because the gap between male and female life expectancy in France is actively narrowing. In 1990, it was an 8.3-year gap. Today, it has shrunk to a 5.7-year gap.
Why does that matter so much? Why is the shrinking gap so indicative of progress?
Because, historically, massive gaps in life expectancy between genders point to intense occupational stratification and lifestyle hazards.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, in the past, men were disproportionately represented in highly dangerous, physically degrading labor mining, heavy manufacturing, construction without modern safety harnesses. There were also vast disparities in lifestyle risks, like heavy smoking and alcohol consumption.
So the fact that male life expectancy jumped by 8 years tells us that the physical environment of the French worker has been fundamentally detoxified and made safer.
Exactly. So the society has literally engineered the premature death out of the male working class while simultaneously pushing the ceiling higher for women.
They have built a baseline of survival that extends well into the 8th decade of life for virtually everyone. And this creates a profound ripple effect across the rest of the society, particularly when we look at the second pillar of the HDI, which is knowledge.
Right. Survival is secured, but a long life isn't necessarily a developed life if it isn't enriched.
Let's talk about the education data. The index measures knowledge using 2 distinct metrics. You have expected years of schooling and mean years of schooling.
Okay, let's break those down.
For expected years, which is basically a projection of how long a child entering the school system today will stay in it. France is at 16.1 years. The global average is only 13.0 years.
And then we have the mean years of schooling. This is the grounded reality. It measures the actual average number of years of education already received by people aged 25 and older who are currently walking around in the society.
And France is at 11.7 years there, compared to the global average of just 8.7 years.
I love how these two numbers interact. Let's try to visualize this. Imagine every citizen has an educational bank account.
Okay, an educational bank account.
The mean years, that 11.7 years, represents the guaranteed, cleared base balance that every single adult has in their account right now. France leads the world by 3 full years of this foundational, actualized education.
Which means the baseline cognitive floor of the entire workforce is elevated. You have a population where almost everyone has not just basic literacy, but advanced secondary or early tertiary analytical skills.
And then the expected years, the 16.1 years, that represents the credit limit. It is the vast potential for higher education that the state is actively offering its youth today. They are projecting that the next generation will spend over a decade and a half in formal learning.
This is where the data points start talking to each other. We cannot look at education in a vacuum. We have to connect it back to that 83.3 years of life expectancy. The synergy between massive lifespan and massive education is profound.
Because they fuel each other.
Yes. Think about the fundamental economics of learning. If a society has a life expectancy of, say, 60 years, asking a citizen to spend 16 of those years in a classroom is a massive, almost disproportionate chunk of their usable life. The return on investment timeline is short.
But if your population is consistently living well into their mid-80s, the entire calculus changes.
Ah, I see. An investment of 16 years of schooling pays immense compounding dividends over a 50-year career.
It alters a society's relationship with knowledge. Because French citizens live so long, that educational bank account you mentioned has decades to compound its interest. They have a longer horizon to innovate, to participate in complex civic duties, to adapt to new technologies.
The health data and the education data aren't just independent variables on a spreadsheet, they are the twin engines of human capital.
Exactly. Long life makes deep education economically viable. Deep education makes long life medically possible through better lifestyle choices and medical innovation.
But, and this is a massive but, I am looking at these numbers. 16 years of world-class education for millions of children, and a sprawling, highly advanced healthcare system capable of keeping tens of millions of people healthy into their mid-80s.
It's all the infrastructure.
That is not cheap. That is astronomically, staggeringly expensive to maintain.
It requires immense, continuous flows of capital. You cannot build high-speed rail, advanced oncology wards, and massive university campuses with just good intentions.
Which forces our conversation directly into the third pillar, the wealth factor. How does France actually afford to pay for this utopian baseline?
We measure this economic engine through gross national income, or GNI, per capita. And to ensure we are comparing apples to apples across the globe, the data uses 2021 purchasing power parity dollars.
Right, which adjusts for the actual cost of living in different places.
Correct. Looking at the 2023 data, France's GNI sits at $55,060 per person. The global average is $20,327.
So from a sheer resource perspective, France is generating about 2.7 times more wealth per person than the global average.
And once again, we see the echoes of that resilience we talked about earlier. In 2019, right before the world shut down, French GNI per capita was humming along at over $56,000.
And then the 2020 economic shock plummeted that number down to around $51,177.
A nearly $5,000 drop per person in a single year. That is a brutal economic contraction. Businesses shuttered, exports halted, tourism, which is a massive sector for France, vanished overnight.
But the system didn't collapse into a permanent depression. The state mechanisms intervened, and by 2023, the wealth generation machine had robustly recovered back to that $55,060 mark. The engine stalled, but the transmission didn't break.
It is a testament to the stabilizing power of institutional wealth. But, and this is important, this brings us to a very dangerous analytical trap.
The trap of the average. Here's where it gets really interesting and where I have a major bone to pick with how we usually talk about global wealth. Average income is notoriously deceptive.
Oh, absolutely.
Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine you are sitting in a crowded neighborhood cafe. There are 50 people there, all making a very standard, modest salary. The average wealth of the room is perfectly normal. Then, a multi-billionaire tech CEO walks through the front door and orders an espresso.
I know exactly where this is going.
Suddenly, statistically speaking, every single person in that cafe becomes a millionaire on average.
The math is technically correct, but the reality is completely distorted.
Exactly. The barista didn't suddenly get a yacht. Nobody's life actually changed except on the statistician's spreadsheet. So when I look at this $55,060 average GNI for France, I have to ask, doesn't this shiny number potentially hide massive systemic inequalities?
It's a very fair question.
Could this just be a society where a few mega-rich oligarchs at the top hold all the capital, pulling the average up, while the working class struggles to pay rent?
It is a completely valid skepticism. A high average GNI can absolutely mask a deeply fractured society. You can have skyscrapers surrounded by slums, and the average might still look fantastic on paper. This is a universally recognized flaw in standard development metrics like the basic HDI.
So how do we fix the math? How do we see what's actually happening on the ground?
The United Nations Development Program recognized this flaw and created a powerful corrective diagnostic tool. It's called the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, or IHDI.
The IHDI, I like that. We're checking the receipts. How exactly does this penalty work?
It mathematically discounts a country's HDI score based on how unevenly the health, education, and income are distributed across the actual population.
Okay, so it penalizes hoarding.
Right. Imagine pouring a gallon of water over a field. The basic HDI measures how much water was poured. The IHDI measures whether every plant got a drop, or if 90% of the water just pooled in one deep hole while the rest of the field died of thirst.
That's a great visual.
If a society is perfectly utopianly equal in its distribution, the basic HDI and the IHDI score will be exactly the same. But the more unequal the distribution, the more the score drops. We call this drop the development loss.
Okay, let's look at the damage. What does inequality cost the world right now?
Globally, when you run the numbers and factor in inequality across all nations, The world loses a staggering 22.0% of its human development progress.
22%. Over a fifth of all global human development is essentially a mathematical mirage for the average person. It exists, but it's locked up at the top, completely inaccessible to the bottom tiers of society.
It is a massive forfeiture of human potential. But this is where France truly separates itself from the pack in the data. France only suffers a 9.1% development loss due to inequality.
9.1% versus 22.0%. That is a massive structural difference.
And if we drill down deeper into the specific dimensions of this inequality, it gets even more illuminating. Let's look specifically at the dimension of health inequality. Globally, inequality in life expectancy, meaning the rich live long lives while the poor die young, causes a 12.9% loss in development. But in France, the loss due to health inequality is an astonishingly low 3.7%.
Wait, pause on that number. A 3.7% health inequality loss. That means almost everyone in France, regardless of whether they are a corporate executive in Paris or a bakery worker in a rural village, is living incredibly close to that 83.3-year average.
Precisely. The system is designed to ensure that the extra decade of life isn't just a luxury commodity reserved for the wealthy. It is a baseline reality enforced across the entire population.
So what does this actually look like in practice? How do they get that number down to 3.7%?
It points to the underlying mechanisms of the French social state. It means that the cost of life-saving medical care is not a barrier to entry. If a working-class citizen develops cancer, they aren't forced into medical bankruptcy, nor are they denied the advanced treatments available to the wealthy.
Because the state infrastructure absorbs the cost.
Yes, ensuring the health outcome is driven by medical science, not by the patient's personal bank account.
Which brings us to the core takeaway for you, the listener. Why should you care about this obscure HDI metric? Because it redefines what a developed country actually is. True development isn't just about building high peaks of extreme wealth. It is about the tensile strength of the safety net strung underneath those peaks.
That's a great way to put it.
France's exceptionally low development loss means that the progress we talked about, the $55,000 income, the 16 years of schooling, the 83 years of life, actually reaches the hands of the average citizen.
It transforms development from a theoretical, abstract average into a lived, daily reality. And this creates a secondary, almost invisible benefit: profound social stability.
Right, because if everyone has access, people aren't as desperate.
Exactly. When the gap between the top and the bottom is mitigated by robust distribution networks, you avoid the extreme political and social volatility that plagues heavily stratified societies.
But you cannot talk about equality or the fair distribution of resources without addressing the most universal, fundamental demographic split in human history.
The divide between men and women.
Exactly. If the wealth and the health are distributed relatively well across economic classes, does that distribution truly cross gender lines? A society might take great care of its male workers, but completely sideline its female population.
This brings us to a crucial dimension of the data, which is gender parity and the synchronization of society. The report provides us with two massive indices to evaluate this. First is the GDI, or the Gender Development Index.
We'll have to find the parameters. The GDI measures the gender gap in human development achievements, basically comparing the female HDI score directly against the male HDI score. A ratio of 1.0 represents perfect, absolute, statistical parity.
In 2023, France's GDI is 0.993.
0.993. They are within microscopic fractions of a decimal point of perfect statistical equality.
It's incredible.
Let's look at the underlying scores that make up that ratio. For 2023, the female HDI is 0.916. The male HDI is 0.923. They are virtually identical.
It means that in terms of raw survival, access to knowledge, and standard of living, being born male or female in France does not fundamentally alter your access to human development.
But we know that achieving the same baseline doesn't always mean facing the same obstacles, which is why the data provides a second, much more revealing metric, the GII, or Gender Inequality Index.
Right, where the GDI looks at final achievements, the GII looks at the loss of potential due to structural inequality in three specific areas:
Which are?
Reproductive health, societal empowerment, and the labor market. A lower score is better here, as it represents less inequality.
France ranks 11th globally on the GII, with a tiny, almost negligible score of 0.034.
To truly understand how extraordinary that 0.034 is, we need to look at the raw, physical metrics hidden in the data file. Let's start with reproductive health.
Okay.
The ultimate measure of how a society values its women is whether it allows them to die while giving life. The maternal mortality ratio in France is 7.9 deaths per 100,000 live births.
7.9. Let's provide the global context for that. The global average is a tragic 216 deaths per 100,000 live births.
That is a 27-fold difference. It is staggering.
It's the difference between a society where childbirth is a heavily monitored, universally safe medical procedure and a society where it remains a lethal roll of the dice. And how do they achieve that 7.9? It goes back to the mechanisms we discussed earlier.
Universal access to prenatal care.
Exactly. Localized clinics in every neighborhood and the complete removal of financial barriers to emergency obstetric care.
Furthermore, look at the adolescent birth rate. This measures births to women ages 15 to 19. High adolescent birth rates usually indicate a lack of bodily autonomy, poor sexual education, and a structural funneling of young women away from education and into early motherhood.
And in France.
In France, that rate is 3.5 births per 1,000 young women.
And globally.
The global average is 39.1, an 11-fold difference.
So the physical baseline reproductive health, maternal survival, and bodily autonomy is incredibly secure. That's the foundation. But survival is just the first step. What about empowerment? Are women actually steering the machinery of the society?
The data measures this by looking at the percentage of parliamentary seats held by women. In France, women currently hold 37.2% of the seats in the national legislature. For comparison, the global average is 26.5%.
And this is where the historical data reveals a truly explosive narrative. If you look closely at the timeline provided in the report, this wasn't a slow, steady, organic climb.
No.
I'm tracing the line here. Between 1990 and the mid-2010s, female parliamentary representation was growing, but it was sluggish. It was hovering in the mid-20s. But right around the year 2017, the graph violently spikes. It jumps from 25.7% to over 35% almost overnight.
That is a massive, sudden structural shift in the political power dynamics of a major global economy.
How does that happen? You don't just accidentally elect 10% more women to your highest governing body in a single election cycle.
No, you don't. While the data file doesn't detail the specific legislative text, a jump that's sharp points directly to active, aggressive structural intervention.
Like quotas.
Exactly. It points to the implementation of strict gender parity laws, regulations that legally require political parties to field an equal number of male and female candidates, often backed by severe financial penalties for non-compliance. It wasn't just a cultural shift. It was a legislative mandate forcing the doors of power open.
I want to introduce an analogy here. Think of a complex society as a massive...
This raises an important question, however, about the nature of this equality. We have to differentiate between what we might call passive equality and active equality.
I like that distinction. Unpack that for us.
The health metrics we discussed, the incredibly low maternal mortality of 7.9, the 86.1-year life expectancy, that shows an exceptional passive protection of women's lives. The state infrastructure surrounds and protects the female citizen beautifully.
But protection isn't the same as power.
Exactly. The explosive jump in parliamentary seats to 37.2%, and the final metric we need to discuss, labor force participation. That represents active empowerment. It is women physically steering the economy in the state.
Let's look at that economic empowerment. Female labor force participation in France currently sits at 52.8% compared to 48.5% globally.
Yes. And while that is higher than the global average, we must be objective with the data. I have a critical caveat in my notes here.
Lay it on us. Where is the flaw in the French armor?
While a 52.8% female labor force participation rate is solid, it is still an area where France has room for significant future growth. If you look at the male labor force participation rate in France, it is over 60%.
Oh, wow.
So while the development indices, the health and the education, are nearly identical, the sheer participation in the active labor market still shows a noticeable gap.
I see. So women have the exact same 16 years of education and they live even longer than the men, but they aren't fully converting that human capital into economic participation at the exact same rate.
Correct. Compared to their absolutely stellar top-tier health and education metrics, this is the one area indicating untapped societal potential. It suggests there may still be cultural or structural friction, perhaps around childcare or corporate culture, that keeps a segment of highly educated women out of the workforce.
Okay, let's zoom out. We need to summarize the absolute powerhouse of a society we've just mapped out over the last 30 minutes. We have a country generating high wealth at $55,000 per capita. They are highly educated, guaranteeing nearly 12 actual years of schooling and offering 16.
They live incredibly long lives, averaging 83.3 years.
Right. They have a massive social safety net that keeps their inequality penalty down to a mere 9.1%. And they have near-perfect gender development, actively pulling women into the highest levels of political power.
It is a picture of profound, meticulously engineered societal comfort and stability.
But, and this is the massive planetary but that brings us to the climax of this deep dive. Traditionally, historically, building a society this comfortable, this insulated from death and poverty, requires an absolute war on nature.
Yes, it usually does.
It requires churning out massive carbon emissions, tearing down forests, strip mining for minerals, and burning through millions of tons of fossil fuels just to keep the hospital lights on, the high-speed rail running, and the universities heated.
Which brings us back full circle to the bombshell statistic from the very beginning of this analysis.
Yeah.
Let's step into the final major dimension, the planetary paradox, and why France emerges as the green champion of the developed world.
Let's recap that unbelievable leap. Under the standard rules of human development, France ranks 26th. But when the UN adjusts the score for planetary pressures, calculating the HDI, France leaps past 22 other highly developed nations to rank 4th in the entire world.
To understand the mechanics of this leap, we have to look closely at their environmental footprint. The data measures two specific things: carbon footprint and material footprint.
Let's look at the numbers. France's per capita CO2 emissions are 4.2 tons per year. The global average is 4.5 tons.
And their material footprint, which measures the sheer physical weight of raw materials extracted from the earth to meet their consumption demands, is 17.7 tons per capita. The global average is 12.7 tons.
Okay, stop right there. I have to push back hard on this. This math feels completely contradictory.
How so?
How can France magically jump to number 4 in the world for planetary responsibility when they are still consuming 5 tons more physical material per person than the average global citizen? 17.7 tons versus 12.7. They're literally eating up more of the physical earth than the rest of the world. How is that sustainable?
It is the ultimate paradox.
Yeah.
And you are absolutely right to challenge it. But it makes perfect, elegant sense when you understand how the PHDI penalty is calculated and what economists call the French paradox of environmental efficiency.
Walk me through the mechanics of this paradox. How do they escape the penalty?
Let's look at the cars that France passed in our imaginary race. The nations ranked 1st through 25th on the standard HDI. Most of these highly developed, wealthy nations see their rankings absolutely plummet when the environment is factored in.
Because they pollute so much.
Yes, because their massive wealth and high standard of living relies almost entirely on burning carbon. They might consume a lot of physical materials, but they also emit 15, 20, sometimes 25 tons of carbon per person to process those materials, power their homes, and fuel their massive cars.
So their high human development is essentially a fragile illusion subsidized by a massive toxic carbon debt.
Exactly. France, however, exhibits extreme, almost unprecedented carbon efficiency. You pointed out that they consume a lot of materials, 17.7 tons. And that is true. Sustaining a modern society with sprawling high-speed rail networks, advanced concrete hospitals, and modern infrastructure requires heavy physical stuff.
Yeah, you can't build a wind turbine or an MRI machine out of thin air.
Right. But the energy powering this society, the electricity used to smelt that metal, heat those homes, and run those trains, is drastically fundamentally decoupled from carbon emissions.
Because their per capita CO2 emissions are only 4.2 tons.
Which is actually lower than the global average of 4.5 tons.
That is the aha moment. Let's pause and truly digest that. They are 2.7 times wealthier than the global average. They live a full decade longer. They go to school for 3 years more. And yet, despite consuming vastly more resources to maintain that luxury, their carbon exhaust pipe per person is smaller than the global average.
I want to offer an analogy to help visualize this decoupling. Imagine a massive, sprawling corporate server farm. Most developed nations are running their high-tech server farms by constantly shoveling coal into a massive furnace in the basement. It generates incredible computing power, but it chokes the entire neighborhood with soot.
Okay, I can see that.
France built the exact same massive, energy-hungry server farm, but they figured out how to run the entire operation on a clean internal power source.
While the data file doesn't explicitly give us the blueprint of the French national electrical grid, anyone familiar with global energy knows the mechanism behind this. This extreme decoupling of high energy use from low CO2 emissions points directly toward a massive systemic reliance on a non-carbon energy mix.
Specifically, their historic investment in nuclear energy, alongside growing renewables.
Exactly. They solved the energy equation decades ago. And because their carbon output is so incredibly low, they're practically immune to the heavy mathematical penalties applied to other wealthy nations in the PHDI calculation.
The penalty doesn't stick because they aren't committing the crime.
Precisely. The PHDI algorithm looks at France, sees the high standard of living, checks the carbon exhaust pipe, finds it mostly clean, and says, "You may pass." Meanwhile, the nations ahead of them on the standard list are dragged down by their massive carbon anchors. Thus, France rises to the top by remaining stable while the giants fall.
This is why we wanted to do this deep dive, because the core takeaway here is revolutionary for anyone thinking about the future of global progress. For decades, we've been told that saving the planet requires a sacrifice in human comfort.
That going green means turning off the lights, halting progress, and lowering our standard of living.
But the French data proves, definitively, mathematically, and practically, that this is a false dichotomy.
It proves that high human development does not strictly require planetary destruction. It is an engineering problem, not an unavoidable tragedy. It is possible to decouple extreme wealth and comfort from extreme carbon emissions.
Which brings us to our final synthesis segment. We have spent the last hour dissecting all these individual data points. Now, we need to put them all together to see the true shape of the French blueprint in 2023, and more importantly, how long it took to draw it.
If you were to visualize the French data on a 5-point radar chart, it creates a massive encompassing shape. France overperforms its base economic growth in every single corrective index we discussed.
Let's run through those 5 points. Point 1, inclusivity. A gender inequality index of 0.034, ranking 11th in the world.
Point 2, distribution. An IHDI inequality loss of only 9.1%, proving the wealth reaches the masses.
Point 3, survival. A baseline life expectancy of 83.3 years.
Point 4, environment. A PHDI rank leaping to number 4 globally due to carbon decoupling.
And point 5, economy. A deeply resilient $55,000 GNI per capita.
But what's truly amazing is that this massive radar chart wasn't drawn overnight. The data allows us to trace a 30-year historical timeline. It's a chronological roadmap of national priorities. Let's walk through the decades.
In the 1990s, the data shows their primary focus was on expanding basic lifespan and education, getting the foundational survival and knowledge baselines secured.
Then, as we move into the 2000s, the focus shifts. We see massive structural improvements in gender equality taking root, heavily reflected in the rapidly shrinking GII metrics and the narrowing of the life expectancy gap between men and women.
In the 2010s, the blueprint evolves again. It becomes the era of reducing overall inequality. The IHDI loss begins to visibly shrink, and they cement their low-carbon transition.
This is when the explosive jump in female parliamentary representation happens.
Yes, and when their massive PHDI environmental advantage is truly quantified against falling global peers.
And finally, the 2020s, the crucible of the post-COVID era. Here we see them successfully balancing acute economic recovery with long-term planetary responsibility, bouncing back to a record 0.920 HDI without spiking their carbon emissions.
Looking at this 30-year timeline, 90s health, Sura's gender parity, 10's inequality reduction, and environmental efficiency, I have to ask a massive question.
What's that?
Do you think this chronological sequence is a required roadmap? For a listener looking at developing nations today, do you have to secure health and wealth before you can successfully tackle complex issues like gender equality and climate change, as the French timeline seems to suggest?
Oh, that's a brilliant question.
Can a developing nation today leapfrog directly to green technology? Or do they have to follow this exact 30-year path of building the hospital first, then making it green?
That is the most profound synthesis of this entire report. The French blueprint demonstrates that moving from a raw focus on sheer growth to a nuanced, sophisticated focus on quality and sustainability naturally takes decades of layered compounding. You absolutely have to build the hospital before you can optimize its carbon footprint.
You have to ensure women survive childbirth before you can ensure they secure 37% of the parliamentary seats.
Exactly. However, a developing nation today possesses a distinct advantage. They can look at this French blueprint and adopt the green technology and the equality legislation concurrently with their basic infrastructure build-out.
They don't have to wait 30 years to discover that carbon decoupling works.
Right. France's success today, leaping to fourth in the world on planetary pressures, is the result of shifting their national focus from more to better distributed and greener continuously over a 30-year period. It is a testament to sequential, intentional, generation-spanning building.
It is an incredible story of human achievement, hidden right there in the rows of a CSV file.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's reiterate the core truth we've uncovered today. True progress, true development isn't just a high GDP, it isn't just a fast car on a track.
No, it's not.
As we've seen in the French model, true progress is about ensuring the wealth actually benefits the population, minimizing that IHDI loss so the working class feels the prosperity.
It's about empowering all genders, resulting in a society that steers straight with high GDI and incredibly low GII.
And perhaps most importantly for the survival of the 21st century, it's about not stealing from the future of the planet to pay for the comforts of today, resulting in that phenomenal leap to number 4 on the planetary index.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, but before we let you go, there is one final, deeply philosophical question this data leaves us with. Something for you to mull over as you go about your day.
Let's hear it.
We saw that France achieved its highest global ranking, the absolute pinnacle of its comparative success, only when the math applied the strict planetary pressure penalty. It raises a fascinating question about human nature and societal progress. Are environmental constraints actually a barrier to human flourishing? Or does true societal brilliance, true structural innovation, only emerge because we are forced to innovate within strict, non-negotiable planetary boundaries?
Wow. Does the boundary itself force the creation of the masterpiece? That is a brilliant thought to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the data. We hope we helped clear those muddy diagnostic waters for you. Keep looking past the average numbers, keep questioning the simple ledgers, and above all, keep asking the big questions. We'll see you next time.